Good Shabbos. I can never quite tell. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes, okay, amazing. So the silver lining of COVID, everybody's like, what is it? Silver lining of COVID is that we're all learning a lot about the Greek alphabet. We might not be getting the order quite right. I don't think Delta comes right after Alpha and Omicron's not after Delta, but we're learning a lot of letters. So this week's parsha is Va-yehi. But before we get to that, I want to take a moment to actually talk about an event we're going to read about in a few weeks, which is the plague of darkness. And in a midrash on the plague of darkness, in a rabbinic interpretation, the rabbis say that the darkness was kaful umechupal, darkness that was doubled and doubled over, a darkness within a darkness. We're living in something of a dark time. There's been a constant back and forth, COVID, vaccines, variants, boosters, variants, masks, test, wash, rinse, repeat. It's been a time of a lot of uncertainty. How bad is Delta? How bad is Omicron? How soon will things go back to normal and for how long? Now, in that same midrash on the plague of darkness, the rabbis say that eventually the darkness was so thick that Egyptians who were standing couldn't sit down, and Egyptians who were sitting couldn't stand. I don't know about everybody here, but I'm certainly feeling a little stuck like those Egyptians. A few weeks ago, some friends and I were exposed to COVID, and all of a sudden, we were back a year ago. We were in isolation, we were wearing masks, we were getting tested every day. Thankfully, our friend who ended up having COVID, he was fine. None of us had COVID, we were fine. But it was a reminder that we're still stuck somewhere in the middle of this arc of COVID. Are we in the middle? Are we at the end? Are we in the middle of the end of the middle? What's very convenient for anyone giving a Dvar Torah is that every single week, there happens to be something in the Parsha that provides the exact right advice for what's happening that week. So the spiritual guidance I'm thinking of is a little indirect. We're going to look at one pasuk, one verse. We're going to look at an interpretation of that verse. And then we're going to look at an interpretation of that interpretation. But by the end of that exercise, I'm hoping we will have a little guidance from our tradition about how to get out of the darkness. So our parsha describes Jacob blessing his sons before he dies. The Torah describes the beginning of the scene. And Jacob called to his sons and said, "Come together, that I might tell you what is going to befall you in days to come." The exact Hebrew word used for the phrase days to come is ba'acharit hayamim. Now the phrase ba'acharit hayamim is a strange phrase for Jacob to use. Although JPS translates it as days to come, which is what I just said, it could also be translated literally as at the end of days, which is how the King James Bible renders it. And also other places in the Tanakh, the phrase ba'acharit hayamim carries the meaning of at the end of days. And so Rashi, the most prominent medieval commentator, also picks up on this unusual phrase. And in order to explain it, he offers an interpretation based on earlier rabbinic traditions. According to Rashi, Jacob was not saying what was going to happen in days to come. He wasn't telling his sons what was going to happen next week. Instead, Jacob was about to reveal the date of the redemption, Acharit Hayamim, the literal end of days, as the King James Bible translates it. Now, why would Jacob want to reveal the date of redemption to his sons? And while he's about to die, why is he even thinking about redemption? Perhaps we can imagine that Jacob's sons are anxious about their future. Their father's about to die. They don't know what's going to happen with Joseph. And also maybe they're realizing that this staying in Egypt thing might not turn out so well. According to Rashi, Jacob knows things are going to turn out okay in the end. He knows there's going to be an eventual redemption of the Jewish people, an eventual redemption of the entire world. And perhaps Jacob notices his son's anxieties about the future and wants to reassure them. He wants to tell them the exact date on which everything will be okay. But, Rashi continues, again according to rabbinic tradition, just before Jacob can reveal the date of redemption to his sons, Rashi says, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, leaves him. But what does that mean, that the divine presence leaves him? Rashi doesn't explain that. At first glance, it sounds like Jacob loses some sort of prophetic power. Perhaps just as he was going to reveal the date of redemption, he suddenly can't remember it. Or maybe he doesn't even believe it's coming anymore. But the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, offers a more complex interpretation of what Rashi means when he says that the divine presence left Jacob. According to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Jacob didn't forget anything. He didn't lose any power about knowing when the redemption was going to happen. But what he lost was the ability to pass that message, that hidden message, on to his sons. He lost the ability to articulate it. According to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Jacob and his sons were on different spiritual levels. They're plugged into different religious radio stations. Jacob is tapped into a field of deep spiritual nourishment, and his sons are focused on their earthly responsibilities. Jacob has this deep, deep relationship to God. And I think it's because of that belief in God, that faith, that he also has faith that the world can be redeemed. His sons, by contrast, who don't have that sort of relationship with God, have trouble imagining that the world could change so drastically. Perhaps they're so focused on getting through the famine, getting through the drought, thinking about the harvest, thinking about the planting, the next harvest. They don't have space, they don't have time, they don't have energy to imagine a different world. They have to deal with urgent problems on a much more concrete level. We also have some urgent problems. We have to mask up, we have to stay distant, we have to watch out for symptoms, we have to get tested, we have to keep up with the news, keep up with the protocols, keep up with the CDC, read the very, very poorly worded CDC website. And like Jacob's sons, it's really, really easy to find ourselves so immersed in those day-to-day efforts to keep up with our lives that we don't have time to imagine a different material reality. We don't have time to imagine what the world could look like. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe argues that we have a choice. Instead of being like Jacob's sons, we can be like Jacob. We can believe that a fundamentally different world is possible. And the Rebbe argues that even though Jacob wasn't ultimately able to pass that message on to his sons, the fact that he even tried opens up a new spiritual pathway for all of us. Specifically, he writes, Jacob's desire to reveal the time of redemption to his sons gave each Jew a power at all times, even when the divine presence has departed from them, even in the great spiritual absence and opaqueness of our time, in which the darkness is kaful umechupal, doubled and doubled over, a darkness inside of a darkness. Even now we have the ability to reveal the moment of redemption. The phrase, the eternal ability to reveal the moment of redemption, is a little vague. What does it mean? I think the Lubavitcher Rebbe means that because of Jacob's efforts, all Jews, perhaps all people, can believe in the possibility of a redeemed world. And as the Rebbe understands it, believing that the world can be redeemed does not come naturally to us. In fact, it's much more natural to believe that the world will always be the way it is right now. Now, what we mean by a redeemed world might not be exactly what the Lubavitcher Rebbe means by a redeemed world. He's talking about the literal advent of the Mashiach, the Messianic age. For those of us for whom that language isn't as compelling, we might say that Jacob's efforts offer us a model for believing that all of the tragedies, oppressions, traumas, trials, and tribulations of our world can one day be healed. But even with Jacob as our spiritual role model, it can be hard to imagine that the world could ever be other than it is right now. It's very, very hard to remember a world before COVID. A world when we would have been surprised to go into the supermarket, surprised to find that everybody around us was wearing masks. A world in which we'd never heard the term social distancing. And if we did hear the term social distancing, we probably thought it meant taking some personal time. But it isn't just COVID. It isn't just COVID. We're living in a deeply, deeply broken world. A world in which so many need what so few have. A world still mired in anti-Semitism and racism, economic inequality and violence. A world with a changing climate. My 6th grade students have been thinking a lot about these questions in the religious school. We've been learning the second prayer of the Amidah, Ata Gibor Le'olam, which talks about God healing the sick, releasing the captives, and uplifting the fallen. My students do not like the prayer. How can we say God heals the sick when there's COVID? They asked. How can we say God frees the prisoners when the Holocaust happened? They thought about it for a while. And eventually they offered an answer to their own question. Maybe the people who wrote this prayer were describing the world they wanted to believe in. Maybe they were describing the world they wanted to live in. When we imagine the world we want to live in, we make that world possible. I think that this is the deeper meaning of what the Lubavitcher Rebbe is saying when he tells us that Jacob's efforts give us the power to reveal the moment of redemption. Not only do we have the power to believe in a fundamentally different world, but our very belief that a different world is possible helps make that world possible. It's only when we believe that the world can change that we try to change it. We're about to daven the Musaf Amidah. And for many of us, like for my students, these prayers might not reflect our theologies or our beliefs about God and the world. But even if that's the case, when we daven, we can still try to see the prayers through the interpretation my students offered. We can imagine the world we want to live in, and by imagining it, we can make it possible. We can help God bring redemption. We can bring this same intention to the prayers in Musaf that we might find it even harder to relate to, especially those that describe the rebuilding of the temple and the resumption of sacrifices. Whatever our feelings about the temple, about sacrifices are, we can appreciate that for the rabbis, rebuilding the temple, resuming the sacrifices, this was redemption. And for them, davening Musaf was a way of stating, insisting, imagining, demanding that redemption was still possible even in spite of all evidence to the contrary. And so in a few moments, when we recite the description of the temple and the sacrifices, let's imagine a world in which these past 21 months are just a memory. Let's imagine a world of plenty, a world of justice, a world of equality. Let's imagine it and thereby bring that world one step closer. Let's imagine it and give ourselves the strength to go out and build it. Imher al b'yameinu, soon and in our time. Good Shabbos.